Religion isn't simply a weird and curious thing that we humans do when we have enough time to sit around and contemplate such trivial matters, when we aren't preoccupied with surviving and fleeing from predators. I would like to argue that the religious impulse is in fact the initial spark that allows us to do anything other than mere survival. Religion is of course a very loaded term these days, and I would like to make the distinction that the religion I speak of is not the same thing as the kind of religion that has been corrupted by the dogmatic and power-obsessed institutions and empires throughout history that primarily seek dominance over others. The earliest origins of human civilization and the earliest origins of religion are deeply interwoven. But the kind of religion that accompanied those earliest humans was far more wild and strange than the kind of religion so deeply embedded in modern humanity's collective consciousness. Religion was an experience, and this experience was facilitated in numerous ways. Through the guidance of an experienced elder, commonly known as a shaman, initiates would participate in ceremonies that included techniques like chanting, drumming, dancing, fasting, and the ingestion of substances of various kinds. This video will explore the concepts of religious ecstasy, ancient pharmacology, shamanism, and witchcraft. The main book I'm drawing from is Brian Murarescu's The Immortality Key, a book that I recently read and thoroughly enjoyed. It primarily explores the Eleusinian mysteries and the famous psychedelic brew known as the Kykeon, but Murarescu also spends several chapters exploring its potential Stone Age precursors. And that, along with a few other fascinating points, is what we'll get into here. First and foremost, a quick reframing of the way we think about religion will help set the stage for everything we'll get into later on. Religion is a complex psychological impulse, and at its most fundamental level, it isn't merely a system of shared beliefs, but a way of orienting human life toward what is perceived as ultimate reality. It assumes that the visible world isn't the full story, and it seeks to align the individual and the community with that order through myth, ritual, and sacrifice. It begins with an encounter with what many have called the numinous, the mysterium tremendum, or the holy other. These are often personal experiences of altered states of consciousness which confound the rational mind and defy our ability to capture them in language. Religion structures time around transcendence. It implies that one holds an image of a future state which isn't presently realized, and that the bridge from the real to the ideal is achieved through the motifs of ritual and sacrifice. In this sense, religion is the symbolic and embodied effort to bring human life into conscious relationship with the unseen architecture of reality. It likewise involves a sense of the ultimate unity and interconnectedness of all beings and things, as described by the mystics since time immemorial. And this psychological impulse is deeply rooted in our past, evident in some of the oldest archaeological sites, such as Paleolithic burial chambers and ceremonial settings. In a paper titled Fermented Beverage and Food Storage in 13,000-year-old Stone Mortars at Rockafet Cave, Israel, evidence of the earliest fermentation was found. The study examined 3 limestone mortars discovered in a Natufian burial chamber in modern-day Mount Carmel, just outside Haifa, Israel. This site has many signs of ritual and religious activity, as about 30 burials were found, many with floral grave linings and animal bones inside them. The stone mortars underwent some rigorous testing, and the residue of numerous plants were found. The team at Stanford found many of the micro remains to have the distinctive damage features typical of malting, and they believed these stone mortars to be evidence of some kind of prehistoric beer brewing. This was most likely a mortuary sacrament used to venerate their ancestors. At roughly 13,000 years old, this makes Rockafet Cave the earliest known experiment in making fermented beverages in the world. While the Natufian Rockafet Cave holds the title for the oldest evidence of beer brewing in the world, it's certainly not the only example we can find in the deep past. Göbekli Tepe is an archaeological site that has become very famous in recent years. Its original architects remain elusive. However, we know with some certainty that they would likely have been descendants from that Natufian culture. Dated to roughly 11,000 years ago in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe shows strong evidence of early beer brewing. Large limestone troughs that would have held up to 42 gallons of liquid were excavated. Of most significance is the fact that these stone vats contain traces of calcium oxalate, aka beer stone, one of the strongest indicators for ancient beer fermentation. Göbekli Tepe was most likely a religious site connected to the afterlife. Many of the animals carved into the pillars are associated with the defleshing of corpses, although it's important to note that this is speculative, and there are many competing perspectives on what this site actually was. However, what Rakefet Cave and Göbekli Tepe seem to indicate is that the very first evidence of civilization didn't start with people gathering together to munch on a bunch of stale bread. There is no evidence of permanent settlement here. Rather, they were brewing potent, mind-altering beverages. There is an ongoing debate among anthropologists as to whether the agricultural revolution was kickstarted with bread or beer. The transition from Paleolithic life of hunting and gathering to Neolithic life of sedentary farming is probably the most significant shift in human consciousness and human history, and according to the historian J.D. Sawyer, it seems highly unlikely that the very first farmers would have been successfully able to lure the passing hunters and gatherers into their new and risky agricultural endeavor with just some stale pieces of bread. Sawyer argued that since the brewing and fermentation process is far easier than baking, and brewing being more socially appealing, it must have instead been a mind-altering potion like beer. Prior to the Neolithic, we were much healthier as well, so whatever caused us to change must have been important, and probably carried religious significance. Whether it was beer or bread that started this whole thing has far-reaching implications for the roots of human civilization and the world we live in today. In our times, beer is a heavily standardized and predictable beverage consisting of water, barley, hops, and yeast. There's low contamination, and alcohol levels are tightly controlled. What most people don't know, however, is that prior to the 16th century, beer was a mysterious and complex blend of numerous different herbs, plants, and spices. Occurring only 1 year prior to Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which bootstrapped the Protestant Reformation, a Bavarian duke passed the Purity Law in 1516. This law was about what ingredients to exclude, rather than include, in beer. Before this time, potentially going back all the way to the Stone Age, beer was highly intoxicating, narcotic, aphrodisiacal, potentially deadly, psychotropic, and occasionally hallucinogenic. While purity, relating to quality control and other economic measures went into this law's enactment, a deeper reading of its significance is undeniably related to theological purity. In the 5 or so centuries before the Purity Law, psychedelic beers known as Gruit ales were produced in medieval times. As Murarescu points out, these German ales sometimes would have contained henbane, a plant of the nightshade family which is poisonous if eaten, but also hallucinogenic, a herb which became anthropomorphized as witches and whores. Many of these ales would have been mildly psychoactive, or potentially narcotic in high doses. Festival or ritual brews may have veered into psychedelic territory, with ergot contamination also being a very real possibility. We can trace a long and strange history of beer going back all the way to the previously mentioned Stone Age sites of Rakefet Cave and Göbekli Tepe. Other finds worth mentioning include that of a Neolithic burial chamber called Khan Sadurni, where that same calcium oxalate was discovered in a jar dated to around 3470 BC. Another find dates to around 2340 BC, in which the alkaloid hyoscamine and traces of barley beer were discovered undisturbed in another burial cave at Calvari de Amposta in Tarragona, just south of Barcelona. The remains were interpreted as a hallucinogenic beer that was consumed during mortuary ceremonies. All of these sites have religious, ceremonial, and mortuary significance, while also bearing the oldest known evidence of beer fermentation. What we're looking at here isn't just the origins of beer, but rather the origins of ritualized, altered experience. Long before religion ossified into hierarchy and dogma, long before the Eucharist became stale bread and wine, it was a direct, participatory experience which was heavily mediated through the use of plants and drugs. This is why stressing the difference between modern and ancient beer is such a crucial point, and this includes wine as well, because when we read primary sources about these drinks, we're missing some crucial context if we assume these to be the same mild brews of today. Rather, ancient and prehistoric beers and wines were some really wild stuff, and the people responsible for making them saw no clear distinctions between the realms of medicine, healing, religion, and magic. What this seems to indicate is that altered states of consciousness have played a much bigger role in the development of our species than previously assumed. So, if we return to the beer versus bread debate, it leads us to ask, was the move towards civilization motivated primarily by a desire for a steady supply of grains? Or was it a desire for controlled access to transcendence? Before there was anything resembling institutionalized religion, the most archaic forms of religion were shamanic, what the Romanian historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, called the archaic techniques of ecstasy, were various kinds of psychotechnologies employed by shamans in order to procure information that was otherwise unattainable. Quote, "Even with closed eyes, the initiate can see through the darkness and perceive things and coming events which are hidden from others. Thus they look into the future and into the secrets of others. Nothing is hidden from him any longer. Not only can he see things far, far away, but he can also discover souls, stolen souls, which are either kept concealed in far, strange lands or have been taken up or down to the land of the dead." Since time immemorial, the shaman was the mediator between the terrestrial and celestial realms. The motif of magical flight is a common theme documented in shamanic cultures all around the world. Through these ecstatic techniques, the shaman becomes disembodied and is capable of flying between the worlds, often ascending a world tree or celestial pole. Shamans had an extensive knowledge of the natural world, which was attained by various methods of divination and intuition, and they used this knowledge, among other things, to procure techniques for interacting with the spirit world. For thousands of years, in various parts of the world, they were the authority with respect to advanced herbal knowledge. Knowing which combinations of plants produced the specific effects they needed, they passed down this knowledge through a long lineage of oral traditions and mythologies. Like the shamans of prehistoric times, from antiquity through to the Middle Ages and even the Renaissance, women, specifically older women, became the primary custodians of arcane herbal remedies. In 1387, for example, there was an Italian witch who traveled around brewing a strange Eucharist potion made from the emissions of a large toad and the ashes of burned hares. It is well known that the secretions of certain poisonous toads contain psychoactive compounds like bufotenin, a drug which is similar to DMT. Speaking on this strange brew, the author of the study, Thomas Hatsis, says, "At the responsible dose, anyone who drank the toad Eucharist was said to understand all the secrets of the sect and forever question orthodox teaching." Everyone is familiar with the image of the strange old witch stirring potions in her cauldron. In the mythology of Western civilization, witches are almost always portrayed as malicious female villains with a particular appetite for children. But this is more so a modern reconstruction, or degradation, of a much older archetype. Over time, the shamanic healer with a knowledge of plants and herbs eventually became the evil and malevolent witch. Even the caricature of the witch flying on her broomstick is likely a distorted cultural memory of the shaman's magical flight. This is not so much a direct historical continuity, but more so a kind of archetypal pattern repeating across cultures. Numerous interpretations relating to the causes of the witch hunts have been put forward by historians over time. While it is likely a combination of many factors, one crucial reason is largely due to the fact that the Catholic Church and Protestants grew increasingly more suspicious of folk healers that operated outside the purview of church authority. Healing was of course seen to ultimately come from God. In pre-Christian Europe, the elderly woman with a knowledge of herbs was revered as a healer, midwife, seer, or ritual specialist. In Greek myth, you have figures like Circe and Medea, women skilled in pharmaca, drugs, potions, and poisons. All of this is more generally known as the archetype of the old crone, or the wise old woman. Like many pre-Christian traditions, the Greeks revered the goddess in three main forms: the young virgin, the mother, and the old crone. Interestingly, Christianity would come to celebrate Mary for her virginity and motherhood, but the grandmother with a knowledge of herbs would come to be demonized and hunted by the Inquisition. According to the scholar and Jungian psychoanalyst Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the crone is the one who sees far, who looks into the spaces between the worlds and can see what is coming, what has been, and what is now, and what underlies and stands behind many things. The crone represents the ability to see, more than just with one's eyes alone, but to see with the heart's eyes, with the soul's eyes, through the eyes of the creative force and the animating force of the psyche. Estes' description of the old crone sounds awfully similar to Mircea Eliade's description of the shaman's visionary perception, and this would seem to indicate that witches operated in a similar domain that the shamans did. Tragically, however, history has shown us that both parties would come to endure a long and violent period of persecution as well. It thus seems evident that the witch and the crone is a kind of cultural mutation of that same shamanic lineage. As religion centralized authority and became increasingly more involved in politics and power, it saw the more archaic modes of religion and healing to be a threat to its control. How convenient it was that the standard brew of the modern world became the one which numbs the senses and dulls the mind. The potent herbs of the Gruit ales were replaced with the sedative properties of hops. Furthermore, if anyone can brew a psychedelic Eucharist in their kitchen, then the church loses its role as the primary gatekeeper of religious experience and the afterlife. Is it any surprise that the first ever case of a book being universally banned by the church, Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, was one which explicitly spoke of the innate human capacity to reach apotheosis, that is, becoming godlike, by means of drinking a beverage which offered the gift of immortality? Is it any surprise that the reason Christianity excluded women from positions of leadership in the church had much to do with fears of the wise old woman and her knowledge of plants? By banning the first perennial philosopher and demonizing the wise old crone, the institution effectively shut the doors to the direct experience of God. Nothing is worse for the clergy's bottom line than a population of self-actualized mystics. Decisions like these were necessary if they wanted to retain a congregation of followers. Religion begins as experience, not doctrine. It begins with a direct encounter of the numinous, and this apprehension of transcendence, of the unseen, serves as the initial spark which allows us to move beyond mere instinct and survival. That initial religious impulse never went away. Rather, it's simply being suppressed and channeled into different outlets. Archaeological evidence has shown that altered states of consciousness were foundational to early religious life. Rockefort Cave, Göbekli Tepe, and many more prove that fermentation of psychoactive brews accompanied mortuary and religious contexts. The beer versus bread debate reframes civilization's origins as being motivated by intimations toward altered consciousness, rather than simply nutrition. The crucial caveat being that prehistoric beer and modern beer are radically different beverages. The boundaries between religion, healing, medicine, and magic were once non-existent, and they all served as tools employed by the shamans who mediated and interpreted the unseen realms. Direct, personal religious experience is a direct threat to power structures. Individuals engaging in those practices were historically persecuted by those same power structures, who sought to mediate it and safeguard it for themselves. Witches became villains, beer became sanitized, and mystery religions became history books. And finally, altered states of transcendence serve as cultural and evolutionary catalysts, and civilization can ultimately be seen as a quest for transcendence. Psychoactive plants are simply one of many ways to transcendence. Our greatest power is our own experience. Our sense of I am is, at the most fundamental level, synonymous with all other I ams, which is itself the same revelation of ultimate reality, universally experienced in altered states of consciousness and shared by shamans and mystics alike since time immemorial. That'll be all for this one. Let me know your thoughts below. Till next time, stay curious. Peace.